This is the diplomatic notification they delivered through formal channels at 6 o'clock this morning. For 31 months, the Trump administration has maintained that its foreign policy represents a fundamental course correction from what it characterized as decades of American accommodation to allied demands, excessive deference to multilateral consensus, and failure to prioritize American interests in international negotiations. The Greenland Strategic Partnership was presented as the definitive vindication of this approach, demonstrating that determined presidential leadership could achieve strategic breakthroughs that cautious bureaucratic processes and diplomatic convention had rendered impossible for previous administrations. But this morning, Tuesday, February 25th, 2026, the complete collapse of American international influence has produced what senior diplomats and national security professionals describe as a transition from allied disappointment and concern to active hostility toward American leadership that threatens the fundamental architecture of Western democratic cooperation. Breaking developments from coordinated diplomatic actions across 38 democratic nations, emergency sessions of international organizations, and formal communications to the State Department reveal that allied governments have moved beyond establishing alternative frameworks for cooperation to actively working to constrain American influence in international affairs and to create obstacles to American policy objectives. We are witnessing the formation of explicit voting blocs in international organizations designed to prevent American resolutions from receiving approval. We are witnessing coordinated diplomatic campaigns to isolate American positions and to build coalitions supporting alternatives that directly contradict American preferences. We are witnessing the imposition of economic countermeasures that go beyond defensive protection of allied interests to offensive targeting of American commercial advantages and financial predominance. The transformation from allied frustration with American policy to active opposition to American influence represents a qualitative shift in international relations without precedent in the post-war period and signals the emergence of a fundamentally different global order where American power faces systematic resistance from the very nations that were traditionally its closest partners. The immediate catalyst for this escalation from defensive positioning to offensive countermeasures stems from American responses to the Paris Declaration and the measures that allied governments announced to protect their interests. According to diplomatic communications obtained by international media organizations, the White House reacted to the Paris Declaration not with policy adjustments or renewed consultation, but with a series of actions that allied governments interpreted as deliberate attempts to punish nations that participated in the coordinated criticism. These actions included the imposition of additional tariffs on products from several European nations that were signatories to the Paris Declaration, the cancellation of previously scheduled diplomatic engagements, including a planned state visit by a European head of government, the withdrawal of American support for international development projects in which allied nations were partners, and threats conveyed through diplomatic channels that nations continuing to oppose American policy would face consequences affecting their access to American markets, technology, and security cooperation. These retaliatory measures convinced allied governments that the current American administration views international relationships as purely transactional arrangements where support must be purchased through compliance and where criticism triggers punishment. This understanding has fundamentally altered allied calculations about how to engage with the United States. Rather than continuing to attempt diplomatic persuasion while implementing defensive measures to protect their interests, allied governments have concluded that the only effective approach to dealing with the current American administration involves actively constraining American power and influence to limit the damage that American policy dysfunction can inflict on international stability and allied interests. The transition to this more confrontational posture reflects allied assessment that continued accommodation or forbearance would be interpreted as weakness and would invite additional American demands and threats rather than facilitating productive cooperation. The operational manifestation of this shift to active opposition began with coordinated actions in the United Nations Security Council, where European and Asian members worked together to block an American-sponsored resolution regarding sanctions on a nation involved in regional disputes. The resolution would normally have received routine support from allied nations, given general agreement about the underlying security concerns. However, allied representatives coordinated their opposition, and the resolution failed to achieve the necessary votes for approval. Following the vote, diplomatic sources indicated that the decision to oppose the American resolution was not based on substantive disagreement with its objectives, but rather represented a deliberate demonstration that allied nations would no longer provide automatic support for American initiatives, regardless of their merits. The message being communicated was that American influence in international forums now depends on building support through persuasion and accommodation, rather than relying on historical patterns of deference. The pattern established in the Security Council vote has been replicated across multiple international organizations in recent days. In the World Trade Organization, allied nations coordinated opposition to an American complaint regarding trade practices by another nation, with allied representatives arguing that American trade policy has itself departed so fundamentally from WTO principles that the United States lacks standing to bring complaints against other members. In the International Monetary Fund, European and Asian executive directors voted together to approve lending arrangements that the American representative opposed, demonstrating that the traditional American veto power over IMF decisions has effectively been neutralized through coordinated allied opposition. In UNESCO and other specialized agencies, allied nations have submitted resolutions directly contradicting American positions on issues ranging from internet governance to climate policy, forcing votes where American isolation becomes publicly visible through recorded opposition by large majorities of member states. The economic dimensions of the hostile turn in allied posture involve measures that extend beyond defensive tariff retaliation to offensive targeting of American commercial advantages and financial predominance that have been sources of American power for decades. The European Union approved a comprehensive package of measures on Monday designed to accelerate the reduction of European dependence on American technology platforms, financial services, and energy supplies. The measures include substantial subsidies for European technology companies developing alternatives to American social media platforms, search engines, and cloud computing services. The package provides regulatory advantages for European financial institutions and payment systems that reduce dependence on American banks and dollar-denominated transactions. The measures establish preferential treatment for energy supplies from non-American sources, including accelerated approval processes for pipeline infrastructure from alternative suppliers and guaranteed purchase agreements for liquefied natural gas from producers outside the United States. The stated rationale for these measures emphasizes strategic autonomy and the need to reduce European vulnerability to American policy volatility. However, the practical effect is to systematically disadvantage American companies in European markets and to redirect commercial relationships and capital flows away from American destinations. The financial impact will be substantial across multiple sectors. American technology companies derive approximately 30% of their global revenues from European operations, representing over $200 billion annually. The European subsidies and regulatory preferences for domestic competitors will erode this market share significantly over the coming years. American financial institutions process trillions of dollars in European transactions annually, generating substantial fee income and providing American regulators with visibility into global financial flows. The development of alternative European payment systems will reduce American centrality to international finance and diminish the effectiveness of financial sanctions as instruments of American foreign policy. The Asian democracies have implemented parallel measures through different mechanisms reflecting distinct economic structures and relationships with the United States. Japan announced on Monday a comprehensive industrial policy initiative providing government support for the development of domestic alternatives to American technology and defense systems. The initiative includes funding for Japanese companies developing semiconductor manufacturing capabilities independent of American intellectual property and equipment, support for defense contractors producing weapons systems that reduce Japanese military dependence on American suppliers, and incentives for Japanese corporations to diversify supply chains away from single-country dependencies, including excessive reliance on American components. South Korea announced similar measures with particular emphasis on developing independent capabilities in advanced technologies, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology, where American companies currently maintain competitive advantages. Australia announced substantial increases in defense spending directed specifically toward procurement from domestic and allied sources rather than American suppliers, representing a fundamental shift in Australian defense policy that has historically relied heavily on American equipment. The coordinated nature of these economic measures across multiple allied nations reflects sophisticated planning and consultation that has occurred through the alternative coordination mechanisms that allied governments established following the Paris summit. These consultations have involved finance ministers, trade officials, and central bank governors from major democratic economies working together to identify areas where collective action can most effectively reduce dependence on American economic relationships while minimizing disruption to their own economic interests. The consultations have produced detailed implementation plans with specific timelines for reducing American market share in critical sectors and for developing alternative sources of supply for goods and services currently dominated by American providers. The level of coordination and the comprehensiveness of the measures being implemented indicate that allied governments view this economic restructuring as a long-term strategic priority rather than a temporary response to current disputes. The intelligence sharing restrictions that were initially implemented through careful protocols designed to protect the most sensitive sources while maintaining operational cooperation have now been expanded to encompass much broader categories of information and to include explicit prohibitions on American participation in certain joint operations. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, that has represented the closest intelligence cooperation relationship in the world, has been effectively suspended for many practical purposes, as partner services have concluded that the risks associated with sharing sensitive information with American agencies outweigh the benefits of collaboration. British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand intelligence services have established separate coordination channels that exclude American participation for operational planning and intelligence analysis regarding regional security threats. These alternative channels allow the partner services to maintain effective cooperation among themselves while limiting American access to information and operations until such time as American security practices and political stability improve sufficiently to warrant restored inclusion. European intelligence services have taken even more restrictive approaches given concerns about American security vulnerabilities and the possibility that intelligence shared with American agencies could be misused for political purposes or leaked through inadequate operational security. German, French, and Nordic intelligence services have largely ceased sharing human source intelligence with American counterparts and have implemented strict limitations on sharing technical intelligence that could reveal collection methods or compromise operational security. The practical consequence is substantial degradation of American intelligence capabilities in regions where the United States lacks direct collection access and has historically depended on allied services for information. American awareness of developments in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and other critical regions has declined significantly as allied services have implemented these sharing restrictions. American ability to provide warning of emerging threats or to assess adversary capabilities has been compromised in ways that create genuine national security vulnerabilities. The military cooperation restrictions have similarly expanded from initial measures focused on procurement and technology sharing to encompass operational planning and force deployment. NATO military planning processes that have historically been dominated by American commanders and that have assumed American force contributions as the foundation of alliance military capabilities are being restructured to function effectively with reduced or absent American participation. European military commanders are developing operational plans for potential contingencies that do not assume automatic American involvement and that rely instead on European forces supported by coordination with non-American allies. The practical implementation of these restructured planning processes requires substantial changes in force structures, logistics arrangements, and command relationships that European militaries are pursuing through accelerated modernization programs. Pacific allied militaries have implemented similar adjustments with Japanese, South Korean, and Australian forces conducting joint exercises and operational planning that excludes American participation despite the existence of formal bilateral security treaties with the United States. These exercises are developing interoperability standards and tactical procedures that allow the Allied forces to operate effectively together without American coordination, fundamentally altering regional military balances that have been structured around American military predominance. The political signal being sent through these military adjustments is that Allied nations are preparing for scenarios where American security commitments may prove unreliable and where Allied forces must be capable of independent operations to protect their interests. The diplomatic isolation of American positions has become increasingly visible through coordinated Allied actions to build international consensus against American policy preferences. When the United States announced opposition to a proposed international agreement on digital taxation of multinational corporations, arguing that the agreement unfairly targeted American technology companies, European and Asian governments worked together to build sufficient support among developing nations to approve the agreement over American objections. When the United States sought to block appointments of officials to international organizations based on their perceived hostility to American interests, Allied governments coordinated to ensure those appointments received majority support despite American opposition. When the United States attempted to use its financial contributions to international organizations as leverage to demand policy changes, Allied governments responded by increasing their own contributions to offset American reductions and to demonstrate that international institutions can function effectively without American financial predominance. These diplomatic defeats represent a fundamental shift in how international politics functions. Throughout the post-war period, American preferences have generally prevailed in international forums through a combination of American voting power, financial leverage, and alliance solidarity that provided the United States with effective control over outcomes in most international organizations. The current pattern of coordinated Allied opposition has broken this American predominance and has created an environment where American positions face systematic resistance that often succeeds in preventing American objectives from being achieved. The demonstration that the United States can be consistently outvoted and outmaneuvered in international forums represents a form of humiliation that damages American credibility and encourages other nations to challenge American preferences more aggressively. The domestic American political response has been characterized by growing recognition across the political spectrum that the administration's confrontational approach to international relations has produced catastrophic damage that will require years to repair, even with fundamental policy changes. The Republican Party faces an existential crisis as the approaching midterm elections force individual members to choose between continued loyalty to an administration whose failures have become undeniable and political self-preservation through distancing from policies that are producing visible harm to constituent interests. Multiple Republican senators have now explicitly called for the president's resignation, arguing that the damage to American standing and interests has reached a point where continued leadership by the current administration represents an unacceptable threat to national security. Senator Ben Sasse delivered a floor speech on Monday stating that the transformation of allied democracies from partners to active opponents represents the most serious foreign policy failure in American history, and that responsibility lies entirely with an administration that confused bombast with leadership and that alienated friends while accomplishing nothing of substance. Senator Mitt Romney stated in media interviews that Republican senators have a constitutional obligation to put country before party, and that if the president will not voluntarily resign, Congress should consider impeachment as a mechanism for removing leadership that has proven catastrophically incompetent. Senator Lisa Murkowski announced that she would not support the president's re-election campaign if he seeks another term, and called on other Republicans to acknowledge publicly that the current approach to foreign policy has failed comprehensively. These public statements from Republican senators represent unprecedented fracturing of party unity and signal that political calculations have shifted decisively against the administration as the electoral consequences of association with its failures have become apparent. Multiple Republican strategists have privately communicated to congressional leadership that candidates who continue defending the administration's record will face severe disadvantages in competitive races, and that the party's prospects for maintaining any significant congressional presence depend on establishing distance from policies that voters increasingly view as damaging American interests. The strategic advice being provided emphasizes that Republicans must acknowledge the failures explicitly rather than attempting to minimize or excuse them, and must articulate alternative approaches that demonstrate capacity for more effective governance. The business community response has intensified to levels of alarm that are producing active corporate political mobilization against administration policies. The chief executives of 24 major corporations met with congressional leadership on Monday and presented detailed analyses of the commercial damage resulting from the deterioration in allied relationships. The corporate representatives provided documentation showing billions of dollars in lost contracts as foreign customers choose non-American suppliers, canceled partnerships as foreign corporations seek to avoid association with American companies, and reduced market valuations as investors discount the future earnings potential of companies heavily dependent on international operations. The corporate representatives emphasized that the economic consequences extend beyond current lost revenues to include lasting damage to corporate reputations and competitive positions that will persist long after specific policy disputes are resolved. The Business Roundtable released a public statement on Monday calling on Congress to exercise its constitutional authorities to impose constraints on executive branch trade policy and to restore consultative processes with allied governments that can prevent future diplomatic crises. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued parallel statements emphasizing that American economic competitiveness depends fundamentally on stable relationships with allied democracies that are major markets for American exports and major sources of investment capital for American businesses. The National Association of Manufacturers published analyses showing that manufacturing employment is declining significantly in sectors affected by allied retaliatory measures, and that further deterioration in allied relationships will force additional workforce reductions and facility closures. The legal proceedings surrounding Trump Organization misconduct continue to advance through multiple tracks, with grand juries reportedly moving toward decisions about criminal indictments. The Department of Justice has completed its review of constitutional questions regarding prosecution of a sitting president and has reportedly concluded that while the issue involves complex constitutional considerations, the weight of legal scholarship and constitutional principles supports the conclusion that no individual, including a president, is immune from criminal prosecution for serious offenses. The department is reportedly preparing indictments that would be filed either against the president directly or against close associates with the president named as an unindicted co-conspirator, forcing judicial resolution of the constitutional questions through actual cases rather than through abstract legal opinions. The charges under consideration reportedly include securities fraud based on misrepresentations to investors about the Greenland Partnership, wire fraud based on use of electronic communications to execute the fraudulent scheme, false statements to federal officials based on representations made to government agencies about regulatory compliance, and conspiracy to defraud the United States based on coordinated efforts to mislead multiple government entities. The evidence supporting these potential charges has been compiled through extensive document reviews, witness testimony from corporate executives and government officials, and analysis of communications obtained through subpoenas and search warrants. The strength of the evidence has apparently convinced prosecutors that criminal charges are warranted despite the unprecedented nature of indicting a sitting president and the constitutional crisis that such action would precipitate. The convergence of comprehensive international hostility manifested through coordinated economic measures and diplomatic isolation, domestic political collapse as Republican unity disintegrates under electoral pressure, business community alarm producing active corporate opposition to administration policies, and imminent criminal charges based on well-documented misconduct has created a governance crisis of extraordinary severity. The administration faces systematic opposition from virtually every direction while lacking the institutional capacity or political support to mount effective responses. The president's public statements continue to blame critics and to characterize allied actions as evidence of conspiracy rather than acknowledging policy failures or adjusting approaches. White House staff report that the president has become increasingly isolated within his own administration, as senior officials recognize that association with failed policies threatens their own professional reputations and potential criminal liability. Multiple cabinet secretaries have reportedly retained personal legal counsel and are cooperating with investigators examining administration conduct. Senior military officers have communicated through private channels to congressional leadership that they view the deterioration in alliance relationships as creating genuine threats to American security that require urgent attention through mechanisms outside normal executive branch processes. The scenarios for resolution have narrowed to outcomes involving either immediate political intervention through resignation or removal mechanisms, or continued deterioration through the midterm elections followed by intense congressional oversight and potential impeachment. The midterm elections scheduled for November are now approximately 8 months distant. Current polling shows catastrophic losses for Republicans across competitive races, with predictions of unified Democratic control of Congress with substantial majorities. If these predictions materialize, the final 2 years of the Trump presidency would involve legislative gridlock, comprehensive investigations of administration conduct, and highly probable impeachment proceedings based on accumulated evidence of misconduct. The political and constitutional trauma associated with this scenario makes it increasingly likely that alternative resolution mechanisms may be pursued before elections occur. The international community has concluded through coordinated actions over recent weeks that the current American administration represents an active threat to international stability rather than merely an unreliable partner, and that protection of allied interests requires not just defensive measures but active efforts to constrain American influence and to build international coalitions that can prevent American policy preferences from being implemented. This shift from accommodation to active opposition represents a fundamental transformation in how allied nations relate to the United States and signals the emergence of a post-American international order where American power faces systematic resistance from nations that were historically its closest supporters. The investments that allied governments are making in alternative institutions, independent capabilities, and coordinated opposition strategies create realities that will persist regardless of future changes in American leadership, fundamentally and perhaps permanently altering America's role in the world.